Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Data Dashboard webinar and overview. I am Laura Chavez, the Director of Research and Data here at the Clean Slate Initiative, and I am thrilled to see so many of you joining us today. This webinar is a pivotal moment for us in advancing our understanding and advocacy for Clean Slate policies, and we are excited to be able to bring you all this session that will be moderated by Jesse Kelly, our Senior Policy Strategist, and led by Sam Sinyangwe, our data scientist here at CSI. And I want to say first and foremost that Sam's contributions to putting together and refining our data model methodology and dashboard that he's going to discuss today cannot be overstated. He has been instrumental in bringing this entire project to fruition. I also want to acknowledge the invaluable insights that we've received throughout the process of building our data model and dashboard from our colleagues at the University of Georgia, the Brennan Center for Justice, SEARCH, the Prison Policy Initiative, the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, Code for America, and RTI International, among others. But that collective wisdom has really enhanced the quality and rigor of our data and our analyses. So today we'll dive into our data and dashboard. And as we proceed, I encourage you to consider how the dashboard can inform your work and how our partners and Clean Slate advocates can leverage it to champion more equitable outcomes for our legislation. So with that, thank you once again for joining us. I'm looking forward to an enlightening webinar, and I will pass it over to Sam to get us started.
Thank you, Laura. So I'm Sam Sinyangwe, data scientist at Clean Slate Initiative, and I'm going to talk about this data dashboard. So I'm going to pull up a few slides here. All right. So I'm going to cover a few concepts. First, this has been a project that has taken 2 years to actually build out, and now we're excited to share this data dashboard, which you can already see and interact with at cleanslateinitiative.org/data. But to get there, we had to do a range of different aspects of data work to build out a analysis that could help us provide estimates for each state, all 50 states plus DC, to understand the total population with a record, whether that was a record that included a conviction or not, to understand how that population breaks down by race, ethnicity, and gender, and then to continue to improve and refine our estimates, as Laura said, in consultation with experts in the field to better understand and produce estimates that are in line with current research around the population with felony convictions, the population with misdemeanor convictions, research done by Professors Shannon and Eugen, as well as research done by the Brennan Center. And now what we have is a data dashboard that not only provides that overview of who has a record, but also can help inform efforts to clear those records, provide relief to people who have a conviction or non-conviction record by helping to estimate the population that would be impacted by a range of different clean slate laws across the country. So to start with, when I got started on this work with Clean Slate Initiative, the first thing that we did really was scan the field, scan the research that exists to better understand, who out there has estimated the total population with a record. How many people are there that have a record? How does that break down by race? How does it break down by state? How can we better understand the landscape of the population with a record and the types of records that people have? And so there were really two foundational efforts that have informed our data model. First is research done by Professors Shannon and Professor Eugen, really focused on the population with felony convictions. And a lot of this research was focused on the issue of felony disenfranchisement, where in a number of states, if you have a felony conviction, it can prevent you from being able to vote. And so a number of efforts have tried to estimate how many people across the country are unable to vote, are banned from voting because of these disenfranchisement laws, these barriers, these legal barriers to voting. And so they developed estimates that are based off of a range of national data sources. For example, the National Corrections Reporting Program, which is a database of essentially everyone who's been to state or federal prison over the past many, many years, decades even. The National Prisoner Statistics Program, a similar data collection program focused on folks who've been to prison, as well as the annual survey of probation, which includes data on people who have a felony conviction that did not go to prison, but rather were on felony probation. And so you can see the chart on the right here, which is from their study, which estimated the population with felony convictions across the country over time, over many, many decades. And you can see how that population has grown. And so now, according to their estimates, there were about 20 million people across the country who had a felony conviction as of 2010. And so we built off of that model. We extended it further using more up-to-date data going all the way through 2019. And then we also disaggregated that data further, not only to show information for the overall population with a record and the Black population with a record, but also for Latinos with a record, Native Americans with a record, as well as a distribution showing women in particular with a record. Now, what we also did was leverage research that recently came out from the Brennan Center, really focus on misdemeanor convictions. So Shannon and Yugen's work really focused on felony convictions, and we're able to build off of that model. For the Brennan Center, what they did was they took the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, which is the FBI's arrests program across the country. They took data on the total number of arrests reported to that program. They took the types of arrests that were most likely misdemeanors. So these are things that are low-level arrests like disorderly conduct, things like that. And they constructed an estimate that took into account conviction rates, reconviction rates. So how many of those original arrests led to a conviction for a misdemeanor? How many of those convictions represented unique people who had a conviction. So it's possible for you to have multiple convictions. So they had to apply recidivism rates to better understand how many people does that represent who could have one or more convictions. And then they also applied measures to better account for mortality. So arrests that were 20 or 30 years ago. Some of the folks who got arrested are no longer around today, so applied mortality rates to better construct a person-based estimate of how many people across the country have misdemeanor convictions. And so we built off of that model, extended it again through 2019, theirs went through 2017, and further disaggregated that by race, ethnicity, and gender. So you can get a sense of what that looks like on the chart on the right. This is from the Brennan Center's report, but it shows how they take counts of arrests and then they produce estimates of how many people that represents by applying conviction rates, reconviction rates, mortality or survival rates. And so we replicated that process and extended that through 2019 and then broke that down by states, by race, ethnicity, and gender. Finally, to focus on there are a couple other innovations that we applied to this model to extend the research. One, we had to construct a measure of overlap between misdemeanor and felony convictions. So Professor Shannon and Yugen's work really focused on felony convictions, didn't include misdemeanors or non-convictions. The Brennan Center focused on misdemeanor convictions. They created a separate estimate for felony convictions, but didn't really try to account for the overlap between it because you can have both a felony and a misdemeanor conviction. So we looked at data from available public sources, information reported from New York City and even New York State through the Data Collaborative for Justice, information reported from the criminal history repository holders in Texas through our local partners there, information reported from local organizers who obtained data on the overlap between felony and misdemeanor convictions in Florida, and then information reported from the state of Illinois' own administrative agencies that actually showed the level of overlap in that state to construct an estimate of the overlap between felony and misdemeanor convictions in the population, as well as the distribution of convictions. So how many people have one conviction, two convictions, or more? We use the data from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which is a survey that tracks from the time people they have a large sample, something like 10,000 or more population. And they survey people from the time that they're 12 years old all the way through now. They follow them every single year, resurveying them. Now they're already in their 40s. And so they've constructed this database essentially that is like a life course. And every single year they're asking questions, economic questions, but also questions about, have you been arrested in the past year? If so, were you convicted? If so, for what? Were you incarcerated? And so from that, we can construct estimates over the life course of how many arrests, how many convictions, how many incarcerations on average does somebody get, and how does that break down by race and gender as well. Finally, we include in our model estimates for non-convictions. So these are people who have been arrested, but were not convicted. And we do that based off of national conviction rates and state level conviction rates from the National Center for State Courts, and then state level rates from Measures for Justice. And we're very conservative across our estimates. We're very conservative in estimating the population with a record. We don't want to overcount or overestimate the population, and we know that our estimates are likely an undercount as a result. But I'll get into sort of how closely our estimates match with existing official sources later on in the presentation. One thing I should say that is important to note is that there are known limitations to some of these data sources. We worked with the data sources that are available, that are produced by official sources like the federal government and state governments, and information published by groups like Measures for Justice that obtain that data from state and federal governments. But there are limitations to what states and the federal government are collecting with regard to data that affect our ability to estimate the population with a record. For example, it's well known that many of the databases that track incarceration and arrests across the country are known to undercount Latinos and Native Americans, and in many cases misclassify them as white. And as a consequence, that can artificially reduce the disparities that are actually able to be calculated between groups. So we recognize this, and we've taken measures to use the data sources that are the most accurate on those counts. In particular, for example, the survey of prison inmates in 2016, it's actually a survey where they asked folks who were incarcerated in prisons across the country themselves how they identify. Do you identify as Latino? Do you identify as Native American? And from those, we're able to construct more accurate estimates of Latinos and Native Americans who are incarcerated. And we take measures to try to apply those measures to the broader population as well, to understanding that the Uniform Crime Report and other arrest databases similarly undercount folks. So all of that's to say, all of those different data sources we pull together and integrate into one data model. And this is what we produce. Our data model goes all the way through 2019. We have data, on prison incarceration going all the way back to the 70s, data on arrests and misdemeanor arrests going all the way back to 1991. But we worked that model all the way through 2019 as the latest year currently in our model. And we estimate that as of 2019, there were at least 71 million Americans across the country who had a record of some kind. And that's at the state level. This doesn't include federal records or federal arrests, which, it's even harder to construct estimates of what's happening at the federal level, in large part because most of those arrests are immigration arrests, and many of the folks who receive federal arrests actually end up being deported. So it's difficult to understand how many folks are still in the United States today with a federal record, though it's an issue that we're working through to come up with better estimates for. But at the state level, what we can estimate is that 71 million people at least have a record of some kind, and this is how that breaks down. So about 11 million people, 10.7 million to be exact, have a non-conviction and no conviction on their record. So this is ranked by sort of the severity or seriousness of the record and its applicability to many clean slate laws. So as you move from the right to the left on this chart, the severity or seriousness of the conviction increases. And so this is something to think about when we think about who is eligible for clean slate laws. Oftentimes, most laws will include non-convictions, nonviolent misdemeanor convictions, but for some laws, some laws do include, some states do not include certain types of felonies, for example. So according to our model, not only are there 11 million folks who have non-convictions only on their record, there are an additional 23 million folks across the country who have nonviolent misdemeanor convictions and no violent misdemeanors, no felonies on their records. Another 16 million folks have nonviolent felonies on the record. Some of those folks may also have misdemeanors or non-convictions. Again, this is ranked by the most serious conviction, which would be a felony in this case. About 6 million people, just under 6 million people, have a violent felony on their record. And then about 6 million people are currently in prison, jail, or state supervision. So when we look at this chart, we talk about often that the United States has one of the highest rates of incarceration in the world, and that there are more folks incarcerated in the United States than anywhere else. And that 6 million that you see, the gray portion of this chart, reflects everybody who is currently in prison, in jails, and on state supervision. So total correctional control is about 6 million. And yet you see how many more people have a record who are not currently in prison, jail, or state supervision, and what the opportunity is for clean slate laws to clear those records for so many more people. Again, we hear often that 1 in 3 Americans has a record of some kind. According to our model, it's at least 27 or 28% of the adult population has a record of some kind. And most of those folks, the vast majority of those folks, have already been released from prison or jail or state supervision, are already in the population, and ought to be eligible for some sort of relief. So here's how that breaks down by state. You can see, some of the larger states tend to have more people in general and more people with a record in particular. But when we account for population of the state, you can see that in some states, a larger proportion of the overall adult population has a record. It's more likely for people to have a record. Indeed, in at least 3 states, more than 40% of the adult population has a record, according to our model. And in 1 state, the majority of the population, according to our model, has a record in Wyoming. But there are other states as well that have a lower proportion of the population with a record, like Washington State. You can see here 17%. So there's substantial variation depending on what state you are in your likelihood of having a record, the percentage of the population that has a record, and therefore the opportunity for a clean slate law to deliver relief to a broad cross-section of the population. Now, when we disaggregate the data by race, ethnicity, and gender, what you can see are disproportionate impacts. That in particular, for the overall population, about 27 or 28% of all adults have a record, according to our model. About 27% of white non-Hispanic adults have a record, but a much larger proportion of Native Americans and African Americans have a record. In particular, we estimate about 1/3 of the Native American adult population has a record of some kind, and that 46% of the Black population, Black adult population, has a record of some kind across the country. So you can see that clean slate laws offer the promise of relief broadly to the population, in the sense that 27, 28% of the population has a record, but for particular groups like Native Americans, Black Americans, that there's a much larger proportion of the population that has a record, and that record relief can make a big difference for a huge proportion of the population, therefore. You can also see how that breaks down for Latinos here. Our model estimates about 25% of the Latino population has a record, but again, as I mentioned, both for the Latino population and for the Native American population, it's likely still undercounted, the population with a record, because of those administrative data sources being known to undercount those folks. So we take the steps that we could to account for some of that undercounting, but it's likely still exists to some extent, and so it's probably higher than 25% of Latinos who have a record nationwide. You can see the racial disparities here between the Black population and the white population with a record in each state. In fact, you can see that in almost every state, in 48 states plus DC, our model estimates a larger proportion of the Black population as a record than the white population. There are only 2 states where our model doesn't estimate that. It's New Hampshire and Hawaii, both states with relatively small Black populations, which introduces more uncertainty about the estimates. And so it could well be that in both of those states, the Black population does have a higher proportion with the record than the white population. But essentially, it is almost ubiquitous across the country that a higher proportion of Black people have a record than white people in each state. Therefore, clean slate laws can make a big difference on addressing some of those disparities if structured in a way that is designed to do that. So comparing our estimates with prior research estimates, I showed you that chart, which was from Professor Shannon and Yugen's research, estimating the population with felony convictions. As of 2010, they estimated almost 20 million people, 19.8 million people had a felony conviction nationwide. Our model goes through 2019. We estimate 21.4 million people have a felony conviction. You can see some of the other estimates in the research that have been produced to date, and ours are broadly consistent with that, not only for the population with felony convictions, but also the population with misdemeanor convictions. We estimate 46 million people have misdemeanors. The Brennan Center estimated 47 million people. We used much of their methodology, so it's not, surprising that we have a similar estimate, though ours does go through 2019, and accounts for other things, additional things like interstate mobility and deportation. Finally, when it comes to estimating the total population with a record, there are some top-line estimates that have been produced. Many of those have been produced by Search, which surveys state criminal history repository holders across the country and gets estimates of how many folks are in their databases who have a record. And they also cite data from the FBI. Now, the FBI's Interstate Identification Index, which is an effort to come up with one number that represents the total number of people who have a record that doesn't include overlap between people who have records in multiple states, or that also accounts for deportation and some of these other issues. Their estimate is about 84 million people have a record at the state level. The FBI's next-gen identification system, the criminal fingerprint repository, estimates about 80 million people have a record. Our estimates are 71 million. So again, more conservative than what the FBI has reported, but the FBI doesn't include the level of detail. It doesn't include a breakdown by state or by race or by type of record. So this is why it's really important that we have a model that can account for that level of detail and provide estimates that reflect that. You can see the comparison here between the FBI's Interstate Identification Index database as of 2018 and our model as of 2019. In general, again, we're providing more conservative estimates in almost every state of the population with a record, though our estimates are pretty close. There are only a handful of states, in fact, that we have a higher estimate than what the FBI reports, and even then, it's not much larger. So, we've taken a number of steps. Once we produced and sort of drafted this model, we've taken many steps to validate that model, to compare our estimates with other estimates and actual numbers that are reported from research reports and that are reported from official state databases and reports. This is from, for example, you have in some cases the state police will issue a report on the total number of people with a record and how that breaks down. In some cases, we've been able to leverage relationship with Search and other organizations that are able to survey the criminal history repository holders themselves and ask more detailed questions about who has a record and the types of records they have. And so compared to that official data, you can see how our model stacks up. And in general, what we are being conservative in our estimations of a few things. One, when it comes to the population with non-convictions only, we are conservatively estimating that population relative to what we're seeing from other states. Similarly, the population with only one conviction compared to multiple convictions, our model based on that National Longitudinal Survey of Youth estimates that about 40% of the population that has a conviction has one conviction only. In the data that we're seeing from states, it's actually near 60%, which suggests that there's actually a larger impact than what we're estimating for clean slate laws, because many of those laws do have caps where you may be 1 or 2 or 3 convictions are eligible, but not more than that. And so the data we're seeing from states suggests that it's an even larger population that would be eligible because it's actually 60% of the population that has only one conviction. Similarly, the population with violent convictions on their record, we're very close to the state estimates. This is because we're using state level data on incarceration and from the National Corrections Reporting Program that specifies whether it was for a violent crime. And so we're able to leverage the Bureau of Justice Statistics measure of violent crime, which is more broad than the FBI's measure. And as a result, our estimates are broadly in line with what states are reporting. I should also mention our estimates around race are very consistent with what we've seen from official estimates as well. We're not underreporting or overreporting in that regard. We're right on the mark. And so from that, after we validated our model, we have more confidence that our data model reflects the reality, and if anything, that our impact estimates might be undercounting the impact, but definitely not overstating the mark. What we're able to do is construct impact estimates for each of the 12 states that have passed clean slate laws to date. And so of those 12 states, you can see an example of how we do this for 2 states, Minnesota and New York. For these states, we start with everything that clean slate law does. So what's included includes, so for New York, for example, the Clean Slate law includes non-convictions, includes misdemeanors. After 3 years, they're eligible for clearance, a waiting period of 3 years, felonies after a waiting period of 8 years, and it excludes particular types of offenses like sex offenses, Class A felonies. And so from there, we construct, using our model, a proxy for what is in that, for the very detailed and complex system of eligibility that each state has created, which essentially simplifies that to non-convictions, whether it includes misdemeanors, if so, what types of misdemeanors and after what waiting period, and if it includes felonies, what types of felonies and after what waiting period. And so for New York, that includes non-convictions, it includes all misdemeanors after 3 years and all nonviolent felonies after 8 years. So again, excluding the types of felonies that are listed in the state's law. And as a result, we created an estimate about 3 million people eligible for having their full record cleared due to that legislation already in the state. So based on those estimates, here are how our estimates stack up for both full record clearance and full or partial record clearance. So full or partial just means it's the population that's going to have at least one conviction or non-conviction cleared from their record, whether or not it includes all of their convictions, whereas full record clearance means after the Clean Slate law is implemented, all of their convictions or non-convictions will be cleared and they'll have a fully cleared slate. And so you can see across the country, of the 12 states that have passed Clean Slate laws, we estimate overall about 14 million people should be eligible for full record clearance, and about 15 million people could be eligible for partial or full record clearance. So this is a huge number of people across the country. It varies by how expansive the eligibility guidelines are within each state's law, how large the waiting periods are, et cetera. And here's how our estimates match up against some of the official and research produced estimates to date in those states, estimating impact from the law. So you can see the source, who estimated the impact, how our estimates compare with the CSI estimate in purple, the other estimate, the state data or official estimate in gray. And then overall, you can see that our estimates are conservative in almost every state except in Oklahoma, and that in fact, our overall estimates of record clearance across these states are more conservative. Our estimate of about 2.5 million people receiving full or partial record clearance across these states, and the official estimates adding up to 3.1 million. Now, again, you can see a diversity of different sources here. In some cases, the data comes directly from the state police or the governor's office. In some cases, it's data that has been obtained from the state that is then analyzed and reported by research organizations. But again, across the board, you can see our estimates tend to be either right on the mark or slightly more conservative compared to the official estimates and research estimates. Now, that is the impact overall from states that have passed Clean Slate laws. One thing that you can see here is how that impact can break down by race. And one of the things that the Clean Slate Initiative is focused on and cares deeply about is racial equity and making sure that we're delivering the benefits of record clearance to as many people as possible, and that those benefits are felt, particularly for populations that are most impacted by a record. And so that includes Black populations, includes Native American and Latino populations. And so one of the things that you can see here is how what percentage of the total population with a record would see their full record cleared as a consequence of Clean Slate, of various types of Clean Slate laws, depending on how expansive they are. Starting at the top with a law that would clear only non-convictions. And such a law, we estimate, would clear the records of about 14% of the Black population with a record, 12% of the Latino population with a record, and 18% of the white population with a record. Similarly, a policy that adds on up to one nonviolent misdemeanor conviction in addition to clearing all non-convictions would still have a gap. And you can see the gap here, where about 22% of the Black population with a record and 23% of the Latino population with a record would see their full record cleared, compared to 33% of the white population. So essentially, for every 3 white people with a record seeing their full record cleared, you'd have 2 Black people with a record and Latinos with a record seeing their record cleared, which creates a disparity. It could actually exacerbate the racial disparity in who has a record post-implementation. And so one of the things that is very important, as a consistent with a focus on racial equity, is to recognize that as you increase the expansiveness of the policy, as you include more types of records and a higher number of records, where we're not limiting it to only one conviction record, but you can have as many convictions cleared from your record as you have, that those types of laws tend to be more equitable in impact, such that at the bottom of this chart, the most expansive among these options, clearing not only non-convictions, but also all nonviolent misdemeanors, whatever number the person has, as well as all nonviolent felony convictions, whatever number the person has, would clear the records of 66% of the Black population with a record, 70% of the Latino population with a record, and 71% of the white population with a record, which is a much smaller gap than you see with the less expansive policies. So one thing that this data is telling us is that a more expansive clean slate law, one where the eligibility guidelines allow for you to clear not only one or two convictions, but as many convictions as you have, an unlimited number, and that include not only misdemeanors, but felony convictions, in addition to misdemeanors, especially nonviolent felonies, is a much more equitable policy than a policy that is much more narrow in its eligibility guidelines. So all of that comes together and you can interact with and see the data yourself for the nation as well as for any state using the data dashboard, which is at cleanslateinitiative.org/data. Now, there are many sections of this chart, many of which are of this dashboard, many of which I've gone over. It starts with a map of the country and the population, the percentage of the population with a record, how that breaks down. You can use the menu at the top of the data dashboard to see data for a particular state. You can even compare states with one another. And then at the end, at the bottom of that data dashboard, you can see how various clean slate laws would impact the total population, as well as a breakdown by race, and the waiting periods as well. Consistent with how we estimate the impact of a clean slate law, we do account for waiting periods. In many clean slate laws, they state that convictions are only eligible for clearance after, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 years. After the conviction, there's that waiting period. And so we account for that. We estimate how many people would be included in that, would essentially be excluded from relief because their convictions are within that waiting period. And so you can see anywhere from 1 year all the way through 12 years what the impact there could be. So that is the overview. Again, you can email data@cleanslateinitiative.org. We're extremely interested in your questions and your feedback. We want to continue to improve and refine this model over time in response to that feedback, and certainly in response to additional data or reports that you may have seen focus on a particular state that can help us better understand our model and the impacts that we're estimating, and improve and refine those over time. So thank you for listening to my presentation. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Sam. And thanks for everyone who dropped their questions in the chat, in the Q&A. I've added them to a list that we already sort of have running. So now I'm going to turn to both Sam and Laura to try to dive in a little bit more and answer some of the questions you have. So just generally setting the tone a little bit more for us, either Sam or Laura, why did we decide to develop this data dashboard, and what problems or challenges do you think it can help solve in practice?
So great question. I think first and foremost, we wanted to better understand for how many people are impacted by a record in each state, what some of the disparities are in impact. I think more importantly, how clean slate laws can make a difference, how to maximize the impact of those laws such that as many people as possible, and in as equitable a way as possible, we're able to implement those laws such that they can deliver that relief, and that nobody's left out. And I think looking at what was available to date, there are all these databases that are out there that states and the federal government report, but many of them report counts of arrests or counts of releases or admissions to prison. And so those aren't really person-based estimates. It doesn't get us to a place where we can understand how many unique people would be impacted by this, and who are they, and what types of records do they have. And so those are the key questions that our model seeks to address and now visualizes in these charts that are on the data dashboard, so that they can inform and improve efforts to pass clean slate laws such that they can maximize impact.
Yeah, and then just drilling down a little bit more there, one question is, how can states that have already passed a clean slate law utilize this data dashboard?
So it's a great question. First, I should say, our model goes through 2019, so it doesn't quite account for, the impact that clean slate laws may have already had in clearing records. But one thing that is clear is that states can always go back to the drawing board and do better, right? I think that there are many states that have already passed clean slate laws that include, for example, non-convictions. It might include some misdemeanors, but don't include felonies. Or if they include felonies, include only one felony, but exclude a whole bunch of people who might have more than one. And so I think that there are always opportunities to go back and further improve and expand upon the success and the progress that's already been made in states, so that relief can continue to be broadened, can be felt, particularly by communities that are most impacted by a record. And oftentimes you need more expansive clean slate laws to get there.
Totally. And I think we sort of answered Kate's question there, but just specifically regarding Michigan, does the low percentage of people with records reflect their new clean slate law in Michigan, or are those totals as of 2019 too?
So it does not reflect the clean slate law in Michigan. None of that is included. None of the impacts of clean slate laws that have already been enacted are incorporated in this because it goes through 2019. But I mean, there are a couple of reasons why a state would have a relatively low proportion of people with a record. A lot of it has to do with recidivism rates. So places that have relatively high recidivism rates have a smaller total number of people that end up having a larger number of releases or readmissions into prison or rearrests. And so you have a large number of arrests, but it ends up reflecting a smaller number of people when you have a high recidivism rate. And so according to, we built off of Professor Shannon and Yugen's model and the Brennan Center's model, and Michigan was assigned a high recidivism rate in that research, and we've reflected that in ours. That being said, we're open to seeing new data, more data specific to Michigan, to see, maybe the recidivism rate has changed. Maybe there are, other factors to incorporate. And so that's something that if you have data from Michigan, we'd love to see it.
Thanks. Okay, we're going to dive into a few audience questions back to back. So Michelle wants to know a little bit more about data sources that are missing information. She's curious, like, we know that there's undercounting of Native Americans. So when you were pulling data together, did you use other indirect methods, such as using last names to get more estimates of discrepancies between official data and more accurate data?
So we did not. And to be clear, like, our database does not include names of anybody who has a record. We don't have like an individualized database of every person, all 71 million people who have a record by name and location. Like, we don't have that information. That information should be cleared and by a clean slate law. But what we do have are estimates that are built off of state and federal databases that are de-identified. In many cases, they're aggregated. And so that information includes a number of limitations that I referenced around race, ethnicity. There are also limitations around reporting. So one thing that we did with the Uniform Crime Report data. So the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting database, up until about 2021, was the main database for collecting arrests information across the country. It's since transitioned into the National Incident-Based Reporting database, which has a little bit more detail, but doesn't have good data prior to 2021. And so we use the Uniform Crime Reporting database, and that database has issues with underreporting. And so what we did to account for that is to apply the same estimation method that the FBI uses to account for underreporting. So when you hear data on like crime or arrest rates across the country, and there's national estimates of how the crime rate or arrest rate has changed, those are estimates that the FBI produces that they apply a method to account for underreporting, because they know in some states there are up to 10 or 20 or 30% of the law enforcement agencies don't report any data to the program. So for those agencies, they divide the agencies by size of jurisdiction and by type of agency. So like police agencies, sheriffs, and then by size of the jurisdiction by population. And they basically take the count of agencies that, the data from agencies that did report data within those same brackets, and they apply those rates to the agencies that did not report data. So they essentially assume that the agencies that didn't report the data had similar rates and arrest data as the agencies within the same sort of bracket of type of agency and population level. And that's how they account for underreporting. We did that same thing. So to account for underreporting from places where a particular police agencies didn't report, we applied the rate from agencies that did report that were similar to those agencies. So that's one way in which we accounted for underreporting overall. I mentioned the survey of prison inmates, which is where they actually survey people who are incarcerated and ask them how they identify racially. And we're able to leverage that data to account for underreporting around race. But again, these are known limitations. We are sort of doing the best that we can and using the best practices in the field that have been adopted to account for underreporting. But we recognize there's probably still underreporting there, and states and federal government needs to do a better job of improving their own data systems.
Thanks. Okay, we have two more pretty specific questions about sort of the information you were using. Was survival data specific to populations with convictions? That's one. And then two is, does any data go down to the county level?
Yes, so the survival data was specific, and for that we used the benchmarks that were set by Professor Shannon and Yugen's research as well as the Brennan Center's work, where they looked at prior research specific to populations that had been, for Shannon and Yugen, populations that were in prison, and then for the Brennan Center, populations that were in, I believe, in jail incarceration. And then we applied those benchmarks to the survival rates. We also looked at CDC data showing that there were disparities in survival rates by race, and so that's accounted for as well. So yeah, there are differences around this. I should also say, like, the research literature itself is evolving in this space, and there are, in some cases, different estimates around survivability. So I've seen a study that suggested that jail incarceration has particular impacts for Black people who are incarcerated, where it actually lowers life expectancy in a way that it doesn't lower life expectancy for white folks who are incarcerated. So again, like, the research is actually growing and improving here as well. And so we're keeping an eye to that to make sure that our estimates are in line with the best practice and knowledge on this.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to give you a little bit of a break and turn to Laura. Laura, we had a question that was relating to results we've seen in states after Clean Slate laws have passed. Can you give us an overview about any data we're seeing around job acquisition or a reduction in recidivism rates, generally where the research and is leading us from the laws?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're really committed to building the evidence base around Clean Slate laws. So we have a cohort of research grantees from our first research RFP that we put out back in 2020. And some of these scholars are currently looking into recidivism outcomes. And we've seen some results already from some survey research and qualitative research that's really promising for how these laws are impacting people's lives, ability to get jobs and stability, and all the literature that we know. Based on the literature, we know that having a job is one of the best ways to reduce recidivism. And to that end, Jesse, you and I recently published a policy paper on waiting periods that I can link in the chat. But there we looked at the literature on employment and time to redemption and recidivism, and how Clean Slate policies should really be using more evidence-based waiting periods rather than really long periods of time that keep people from that high quality jobs and employment. And I'd also say that we put out a new research RFP in February of this year because we are looking to expand our research portfolio so that we can have more robust research into the impacts of Clean Slate laws. So thank you for asking.
Great. And I think this question is now going to be split between both of you. So I'll let you figure out who's going to go first. But how do you plan to keep the data dashboard updated? And what are your next steps for its development?
I guess I can go. So there are a couple of things. One, and we've talked about this even just now in the Q&A section. I think, there are many states that have already passed clean slate laws, and we want to make sure that the impact of those clean slate laws is incorporated into our model as we update the model past 2019. So I think, in terms of next steps, it is how do we get to how many people have a record in 2023 or even right now, right, in 2024, knowing that there are huge limitations in the existing database and data sources. So one of the reasons that our model goes through 2019 currently is we haven't yet seen from the federal government, they haven't yet published some of the more detailed breakdowns of data for more recent years that we use in our model for years prior to 2019. So detailed data from the annual survey of probation, they haven't provided data with the same level of detail for 2021 or 2020 as they have for prior years. Even the National Corrections Reporting Program currently goes through 2020 or 2021, but not 2022 or 2023. So many of these big data sources that we use that our model depends on, they just simply haven't published, like the federal government hasn't published a 2022 version. In some cases, they haven't published a 2021 or even 20 version. So that's a big limitation for us to be able to update the model to the present. So as those data sources come out, I mean, they are supposed to come out, they just have a lag time often from the federal government. We're able to incorporate that in our model, update our model to the present. We're also having to think about the impact of record clearance into the future. So we want to know in year 1 or year 2 or year 3 of implementation, like how many people can we expect to see their record cleared? How will that population grow over time? And how will that impact the overall estimate of how many people have a record in that state? But there are many assumptions that need to be made to get us there. We have to better understand how to account for things like COVID and the pandemic, where the data that would be incorporated into our model from 2020 and 21 and even 22 may reflect a very different world than what we're projecting into 2025 or 6 or 7. And it might be, across the country, for example, arrests they had been declining over time, but they started plummeting really in response to the pandemic in 2020 and 21. And even in the 2022 data from the federal government, it suggests that arrests are still at a much lower point across the country than they had been before the pandemic. So depending on how that trend changes, the projections could look very different because it could be that arrests never go back to what they were prior to the pandemic, in which case you'll have a much smaller population with a record into the future, which is good. But it might also be that arrests start increasing and that they revert back or even exceed what they were in 2019, in which case that population is going to be much larger. And it's the growth rate of that population is going to be much larger, and it'll be a much more difficult issue to grapple with regard to clean slate laws. We'll have to clear a lot more records. So those are kind of the next steps is beginning to collect that data as it's published by the federal government, beginning to incorporate that into the model and begin making projections into understanding who has a record now and even into the future, how those laws will make an impact.
Thanks. Laura, anything else to add there?
I fully agree. And I would just, so in addition to updating the data past 2019, figuring out the pandemic, no big deal. We also are interested in refining our estimates of race and ethnicity using multiple data sources, and any new state data is going to help us do those year-over-year impact estimates that Sam was talking about. And as more data from the state and federal level come out, we're going to keep reviewing, updating the data model, and eventually maybe even figuring out the overlap between federal and state records. But there's a lot that we still want to do to refine and hone in on this population and figure out our estimates. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, we have about 2 questions left for you guys, and they're both more general, which I think is a nice way to wrap this up. So if you are someone who's listening to this webinar, if you're a state partner who is interested, what tips would you give someone? They type in cleanslateinitiative.com/data. They're there, they're looking at the dashboard. Either functional, logistical, like what should they keep an eye out for? Any tips or tricks when navigating the dashboard?
Yes. So first, when you get to the data dashboard, look at the nationwide overview, and sort of get a sense of what's going on across the country, and then look at the data for your particular state. And one thing that you can do with the data dashboard is you can compare states with one another. And so if you, let's say you live in Georgia and legislators they don't care what's going on in California, and we hear this all the time. They don't care what's happening in New York, but they might care what's happening in Florida or South Carolina or other states that they see as like peer states. And so you can compare Georgia to Florida. You can compare Georgia to South Carolina, and produce estimates that are more in line with, I think, what your audience will want to see. And so that's not only just showing the overall population with a record, but also impact of various types of clean slate laws and who would be impacted. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing is that this data dashboard includes a lot of data, but at its core, it's really focused on helping you make better decisions around developing and advocating for clean slate laws that can make the biggest difference in people's lives. And so, look at it from that perspective, and look at the various policy options and think about what would it take to get us to, the most expansive policy that we think we can get. And how do we make the case for that? How do we make a racial equity case for that using the data? How do we make a case for that using the comparison of our state with other states and how this might uniquely make a difference in our state, because it might be that in our state, a larger population, has felony convictions than in other states. And so we need to include felony convictions in the bill in order for it to really reach a large portion of the population. So the dashboard is designed to help you make those decisions, those policy trade-offs, and be informed using the data as you're doing it.
Thanks. And Laura, do you want to point them to the FAQs on the website?
I do. I think it's helpful. When you go to cleanslateinitiative.org/data, there is a link to our frequently asked questions document that's right underneath the section titled How to Use the Dashboard. And I think that might be helpful. Our written and video user guides might be helpful too.
Great. I just dropped the link to those FAQs so you can check them out. And yeah, we do have a question from Janet about the methodology and your algorithms. How much of that is shareable to others? How much of that is public? How much of that is proprietary to us?
So, and I was just going to mention this, so this is timely. We have a detailed methodology document. I think it's like 30 pages, something in those. I don't know what we ended up with, but it's pretty large. And so I would recommend you read the methodology document. You can get there from cleanslateinitiative.org/data, and read through the methodology. We've articulated in detail sort of how we made each decision that informs the model, what data sources we used, how our estimates compare to other estimates in the field. And so again, like this is a start and not a finish. We're going to continually improve and refine our model and our estimates in response to more data that we get from states and our partners. And so yeah, look at the methodology. If you have any questions after reading the methodology document, feel free to reach out, data@cleanslateinitiative.org. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, and the last question for you comes from Michelle in the audience, and I think it's wonderful. How can we help? Is there anyone listening to this, can they help you? Can they send us information? Can they request data? What do we need?
Yes. First of all, share the data dashboard, and make sure that people understand what's going on in their state and how they can advocate for clean slate laws and the difference that would make. They can go to cleanslateinitiative.org in general and see information around clean slate initiatives across the country. In terms of what would be most helpful for the data dashboard, there are a couple of areas that there's just not a whole lot of data that has been publicly produced. And so we're making assumptions based on the available data, but we wish we had more. And in particular, that has to do with non-convictions. So having better estimates of the population with non-convictions, how many non-convictions they have, how that breaks down by state. That's something that there was less information that we were able to leverage on compared to, for example, when it comes to prison admissions, there was a whole database that had like individualized data on everybody who had been admitted to and released from prison, and had each row had race and ethnicity and all this information. Whereas for non-convictions, that just simply didn't exist. So if you have information relative to your state on that issue, that would be helpful. Also, the overlap between misdemeanors and felonies is something that if you have access to or you can obtain data from your state that shows the proportion of people who have a misdemeanor conviction who also have a felony on their record. That overlap is something that is really important to our model. We leverage that information from, I mentioned earlier, a number of states and other databases and reports, but we could always use more. And then finally, any information around misdemeanor traffic convictions. And I say this because the database we use to estimate misdemeanors is the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. While it is, the nation's database on arrests, they don't include in their data collection arrests that were for traffic offenses unless they were DUI. And so if you got an arrest and a non-conviction from that arrest, or even a misdemeanor conviction, in some states like Georgia, traffic offenses are considered misdemeanors. So you could have a misdemeanor conviction from that, and it would not show up in the arrest database, so it would not be incorporated into our model. And so we want to learn more about how many people have traffic arrests on their record that are not DUIs, how many of those are misdemeanor convictions, and how does that break down by state so that can be a part of our estimates as well.
Great, thank you. And I just want to say one more time, thanks to everyone who joined us for this hour. Thanks to Sam for the incredible and thorough PowerPoint presentation. We appreciate each and every one of you and hope that you will dive into the dashboard and send us some really, thoughtful questions that you come up with. We're happy to make changes and amendments and make sure it works for you. It's meant to be a resource to our partners in the states. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.